we have this, or these, this book. Again, and I don't want to get into the whole supernatural, miraculous versus providential discussion, but we're going to talk about some things tonight that there is no doubt in my mind that God has played a direct role in preserving this book from over 2,000 years ago to now. And the fact that we have this in its complete form today, without the errors and contradictions that so many like to try to say it has, for it to be as complete and authentic and authoritative as it is, it's special. As we've talked about in the last couple of weeks, this book is different than every other book that's ever been written. And I can only believe and put faith and trust in the fact that that's true because of the Holy Spirit's influence, God's work in the preservation, the transmission, and the translation of this book. But can I trust my translation? Can you trust your translation? So we're going to look tonight, hopefully we'll get through all this, we're going to look at the transmission, how we got our English Bible, and then we'll talk a little bit about how we derive authority from those things, or from the book, how we look at some critical theories of interpretation, and I didn't bring it with me, I think I left it on my desk. We may not even get there, but we'll look at translations for just a moment and make some comments about that. All right, so last week we left off with this idea of autographs. You remember what an autograph is? What's the autograph? Anybody? Please help me and tell me I'm a better teacher than this. Either that or... The autograph is the original document. Okay, so the autograph is the original document, and we have none of those. And I believe we don't have any of those, because if we had any of those, can you imagine the veneration of that document?
Mm-hmm. What do you mean?
How some people would elevate that particular document above. Yeah. So, what we have are manuscripts. Now, we don't know how many we had initially, but there are a number of manuscripts and manuscripts of manuscripts. Turn to, I don't think we talked about this, Colossians chapter 4. Colossians chapter 4, somebody read for us verse 16, please. Colossians chapter 4, verse 16.
When this epistle is read among you, cause that it be read also in the church, and that ye likewise read the epistle from
Laodiceans. All right. So, here's something interesting. We don't have the letter to the Laodiceans. Now, some have speculated that it might be actually the letter of Ephesians. Some think it may be Hebrews. I mean, there's a lot of conjecture about what the letter to the Laodiceans is. But I point this out because the autograph is written, and many of these were circular letters. And so that you can imagine, as these letters are passed around, they would eventually, I've been doing my Bible reading this month from my Uncle Steve's old Dixon Study Bible, his old King James Dixon Study Bible. And some of the pages, I mean, he's had this thing since 1940 something. And he passed it on to me and some of the pages are just brown and faded and falling apart. Can you imagine these parchments being passed around in the first century? And so what they would do is they would sit down and they would copy the letter. And so maybe the church of Laodicea gets this letter from Paul, and Paul, as he sends this letter, he sends one also to Colossae. They maybe sit down and have somebody transcribe it, and they exchange letters. So they have a copy and they have a copy. Eventually, you have copies of copies of copies, okay? And these are known as manuscripts. Erasmus lived, well, actually, let's see. I actually wanted to go back to that, but anyway, let me do this. Erasmus published his first Greek text. That is, Erasmus sit down. Did I have this someplace else too? I'm sorry, guys. I'm having a foggy moment here. Y'all call those senior moments?
No.
No? All right. So Erasmus publishes his first Greek text. In other words, he takes all these manuscripts, and from all these manuscripts, he creates a complete manuscript, a Greek text. At the time that Erasmus, in 1516, creates his first Greek text, he had a grand total of 6 Greek manuscripts to work from. So from those 6 Greek manuscripts, Erasmus makes his first Greek text. Today we have over 5,309 manuscripts. And that number continues to grow year by year. Of those 5,309 manuscripts that are available, 95% of them are in full agreement with each other. There's only 5% of those texts that have any variances at all. And of those 5% of variances, they're minuscule. They're really not that important, okay? New Testament scribes work meticulously to keep the text true to the original that they had. Not maybe as meticulously as the Hebrew scribes did, but they learned to scribe from the Hebrew scribes, okay? Now, from that, we get the canon. When I say canon, what do I mean? The word canon means the standard, the measurement, okay? The canon, as we have it, is the 27 books of the New Testament, the 66 books of the Bible itself. This is the canon. The earliest indication is that there were debates and a general recognition standardizing the 27 books of the New Testament as canon as early as 144 AD. Now, I mentioned this a week or so ago. A lot of people today will point to the Council of Nicaea in 325. And they'll say, it was at the Council of Nicaea that the Catholic Church decided that there were 27 books in the New Testament. That's not true. All the Council of Nicaea did was affirm that they believed that the 27 books that had been accepted for nearly 100 years as the canon was indeed the canon. All they did was give their authoritative vote towards this. As early as 180, all 4 Gospels were generally recognized as being authentic: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. In 200, Origen used the exact same 27 books that we use today. Eusebius believed that there were 4 Gospels, the 4 Gospels, Acts, the epistle, all the epistles of Paul, 1 John, 1 Peter, and Revelation, he believed all those were authentic. There were some disputes, but generally accepted James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2nd, 3rd John, which only left the book of Hebrews in question. This is what Eusebius believed, 26 of the 27, and he didn't mention Hebrews. Eusebius was called to actually testify at the Council of Nicaea in 325. So by the 4th or 5th century, all of the 27 books of the New Testament were generally recognized as authentic and authoritative. Okay? Any thoughts or comments on that before we go any further? Clear as mud, right? All right. Real quick, let's talk about textual criticism. Since there are some variants in these manuscripts, how do we determine, or how do scholars determine which passages are authentic and which ones may have changed something here or there? These are the criteria that are used in textual criticism. And so when I was doing my master's degree and I had to translate, so let me back up here for a second. Let me give you another technical thing. This is just so I'm being fully transparent. There are basically two text families of Greek manuscripts. Okay, we won't go into what they are and all that, but you have two. So if we were in ancient Egypt, okay, and we came across this ancient Greek parchment that had biblical text on it, that one piece would belong to one of two families of Greek manuscript texts, okay? And so while you're looking at these and the variances, how do you determine which one is most likely to be the authentic, as close to the original autograph as we have? Number one, the difficult reading is to be preferred. So if you have two texts, one of them is very simple to understand, but it's parallel, and the other family is more difficult. The difficult passage is to be preferred. Why do you think that's the case? Why would the difficult passage be more preferred?
Is that was the original language?
No. The difficult passage is going to be preferred because most often a simplified passage of that is going to be just like it is today, as we'll talk about here in a few moments. With some biblical translations, some scribes would take liberty to simplify the text. Okay? They might be translating it and realize that it's difficult, and so they'll try to help the reader along. Okay? So the more difficult passage. The same thing is true with regard to the shorter passage. The shorter reading is to be preferred. If it's a longer reading, like we talked about last week, Romans chapter 8, verse 1 says, "There is therefore now no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus, who walk according to the Spirit and not after the flesh." The problem is, one Greek manuscript family has that extended reading. The other one has the shorter reading that doesn't include the second half of that verse. Now, verse 4, Romans 8, verse 4, has exactly word for word the second part of verse 1. What scholars believe is the scribe who is writing out, translating, or transmitting Romans 8, verse 1, he knew about verse 4. And it's almost like he had to clarify verse 1. And so he adds it. Now, adding that to verse 1, let's say it's not supposed to be there, okay? Adding what verse 4 says to verse 1, what does that do to the text? Does it do any harm to the text at all? Is it still teaching what the Bible teaches?
Yes.
It's still teaching what the Bible teaches. It doesn't change anything about what the Bible teaches. But in textual criticism, the shorter reading is to be preferred. The older is usually given priority. That makes sense, right? The closer you get back to the original document, the more likely that that's going to be original than anything later that's changed a little bit. The reading that helps explain the origin of the other is probably more original. And a variant that looks harmonized, thank you, wow. Harmonized tends to be discounted in favor of the one that tends to create the problem. Again, if two texts are difficult, it's most likely the more difficult passage, okay? So, scholars will sit down with these two families of Greek texts. They'll use these criteria, and they'll try to determine which is most original, okay? They've done this for hundreds and hundreds of years, for well over 5,000 manuscripts in two different manuscript families. And still, we have a book that contains 95% accuracy from how many different men writing 27 different books, coming from different backgrounds, different places, different times, without any contradictions. Again, I hate to throw the word miracle around, but the Spirit has to be involved in this, right? All right. Now, that being said, by 400, remember the Council of Nicaea is 325. By 400 AD, the Greek manuscripts had been translated into over 400 languages. That's amazing. But what's even more amazing is that by 500, 100 years later, the Bible had been restricted to one language. No longer was the Bible being translated into 400 languages, but only one. Why is that? Anybody?
Just a quick question.
Yes.
You keep referring to 400 languages, but why does it refer to 500?
I'm sorry?
You keep talking 400 languages, your transcript says 500.
Oh, I'm sorry. 500 languages, 400 AD. I'm sorry. 400 AD, 500 languages. But I had my numbers mixed up.
So maybe you lost 100 languages.
Well, what we lost was 499 languages in 100 years. All right, thank you, though, for pointing that out. So we've gone from 500 languages to one. See, the light is shining on that right there. It's my excuse. All right, 500 languages. Why one?
Catholic Church.
Catholic Church. By that time, the Latin Bible was the only language that the Roman Catholic Church would allow the Greek text and the Hebrew text to be translated into. What you have about that time in 400 AD is Jerome. Jerome's Latin Vulgate that was produced between 385 and 400 AD. It was awful. The Latin translation of the Bible that Jerome put out was terrible. And from this very poor translation of Jerome, other translations were made. So, bad translation, bad copy, more bad translations, more bad copies. Just more bad manuscripts. Until 1384, Wycliffe creates the first Greek text, the first English translation, but he made it from not the Greek, but from the Latin. So he took Jerome's faulty Latin text and made an English text. Well, what happens when you take a faulty text and make a new text from it? All right? So, in 1516, Erasmus decides that he's going to put together a Greek text. And so in Basel, Switzerland, he creates the first Greek text from all the manuscript evidence. And he created an interlinear. So you know what an interlinear is, right? You got the Greek text on one side and the Latin text on next to it. And what do you think happened when people started reading the original Greek text and comparing it to this Latin text of Jerome's? They start seeing all the problems, okay? And so there's a reason why the Roman Catholic Church didn't want the masses to be reading the Bible for themselves. They wanted control. They wanted to have to say, so the old adage, and it's true, that in many places the Bible was literally chained to the pulpit so people could not take it and read it for themselves. In 1516, Erasmus publishes his Greek text. Then, a student of Erasmus, William Tyndale, in 1525, takes Erasmus's Greek text and he translates it into English. What do you think happens to William Tyndale? Just about. They tie him to a stake and they strangle him.
Wow.
Now, they accused him of a bunch of other stuff. And there was an inquisition, and he refused to recant his beliefs and all this. But many historians and theologians believe that it was his translation of the English text that really fired up the Catholic Church against him. So in 1525, he creates the first English Bible. Thoughts or comments on any of that? All right.
Wait a second. Erasmus did
Yes.
Greek to English too.
Erasmus was a Greek-Latin interlinear.
Yeah. But he
Erasmus was William Tyndale's professor.
right.
Tyndale was a student of Erasmus. Tyndale takes the Greek text that Erasmus publishes and he creates an English text from that. Yes.
So what happens to the translations of the other languages before that?
They were lost. They were destroyed.
Destroyed.
Yes, the
So-
Catholic Church was destroyed.
So everything was destroyed and it was remade from a faulty text.
Correct.
That's amazing.
Yeah. Now, considering that after them destroying all of these texts that were made in all these 500 languages to one over this period of several hundred years, and then you're going another 1,000 years before you get an English text from the Greek. Mandy, you had a question? Oh, okay. So from Tyndale's text, now I know that's kind of hard for somebody to read probably. Matthew's Bible, 1537, and the Great Bible of 1539, those were English translations that were translated from Tyndale's. So it's almost like they were, we'll talk more about this in a moment, they were updates kind of, okay? So Matthew and the Great Bible, I forget who published it, but they basically took William Tyndale's Bible and they updated it, okay? Then you had the Geneva Bible of 1560, the Bishop's Bible of 1568, and then in 1611, we had the King James Version of the Bible. Has anybody ever seen an authentic rendering of a 1611 King James Bible?
I've seen it.
Wording. Yeah. I've got a copy. I should have brought it over here so you could see it. But Mike will tell you, it's almost impossible to read.
It's not what you.
It's not what you think. It's Old
Not what
English.
we have.
No. It's not what the King James today is, right? And so I bring this up just simply to say, as we'll talk about here more in a moment, do you think there were people that read the Bible in the early 1500s that knew what the Bible taught, did what the Bible taught, and were saved and went to heaven? Probably. Did they do that without the King James Bible? Yeah, sure, absolutely. 1611, the King James Bible comes along, and there are people today, 500-600 years later, who believe that you can't go to heaven without the King James Bible. I mean, that's maybe a little bit hyperbole, but it's almost that bad, okay? Now, I love the King James Bible. I grew up reading, memorizing, listening to sermons from the King James Bible. But I've been using other more modern translations of the Bible for so long now that this past month, as I've gone back and used Uncle Steve's old King James Bible for my daily Bible reading, I have found that it's incredibly difficult for me to read now. The language. I mean, I love the language. I think it flows. It's beautiful. I've got to read it in silence, because if I try to speak the words, I'm just stumbling all over myself, right?
I have to read it a couple times.
Yeah, sometimes you have to read it a couple times. That's right. All right. So what we have here is just kind of a list of, through the years, of new translations in English. In 1881 to 1885, let me put my glasses on so I can see. Maybe, Harold, maybe I didn't have my glasses on earlier. Could be a reason. 1881 to 1885, the revised version. Young's literal translation came out in 1898, and it was a very good translation, as was the American Standard Version, 1901. The King James Version is translated from one of those two manuscript families. Okay? The Young's Literal in the American Standard 1901 is translated from the other manuscript family. So, here's a good way to study, and it's one of the reasons why I loved the old Dixon Study Bible. The Dixon Study Bible was written in King James, but in brackets within the text, they had the American Standard 1901. And so you had the complete text as it was from both manuscript families, which is very helpful, okay? The Revised Standard 1946, the New English Bible, the New American Standard, and you see I've got there 63, 77, 95. One of the things, and we'll talk about this more in a moment, that we need to be aware of is that you can have a translation that is a good translation, and then the update come along and it's no longer a good translation.
Right.
Okay? Today's English version, Amplified Bible, Living Bible, NIV, New King James, so you can see the rest. The Message 2002, the Holman Christian Standard Bible 2004. Over the last 1,000 years or whatever it's been, 800 years, we've got hundreds of English translations. And there's more coming out every day. There's online translations, there's partial translations, there are new English translations that are coming out all the time. So can I trust my translation? What we have here is a chart, and you can look this chart up on the internet. Just put in Bible translation chart. You should be able to look it up. So in the blue is what we would call a literal-based formal equivalent. It's a word-for-word translation. The translator sat down, and their premise, when they translated, they took whichever Greek family of the two, whichever one they were going to use as their source document. They would sit down, and their intention was to translate it as best they could from the Greek manuscript into modern English in as word for word as they could. Now, as we talked about before, what do words do? What do we use words for? To communicate, to understand one another. As we talked about last week, Paul says all scripture is given by, it's God-breathed. The words come from God. They're God-breathed. I want to know the words. Jesus said, the words which I have spoken unto you, the same shall judge you in the last day. John 12, verse 48. Okay? So what I'm going to propose tonight is if you're looking for a reliable Bible translation to be your primary Bible, the one that you use most often to read, to study, to teach, if you sit down to talk with somebody, to have a Bible study with someone, you want to choose a Bible that, one, you're comfortable with, that's readable for you, and that is on that end of the spectrum. Okay? As you progress to the red side, you go from a word-for-word formal equivalent to what is called a thought-for-thought, or a dynamic equivalent. In fact, I believe it was I think it's in the introduction to the NIV. If you actually, has anybody ever sat down and read the introduction to your Bible? Do that sometime. You'll get insight into what the translators were thinking when they made that translation. They'll tell you. The NIV translators flat out said, we sought for more than a word-for-word translation. We were more interested in the thought than the words. Okay? When you get over here to the red, and I'm guessing whoever did this chart put the red up there for like warning, don't stop, right? This is a paraphrase. It's what's called a functional equivalent. They just changed the whole thing. Right? They took the Greek text, sometimes they took the English text, and they just paraphrased it. They just changed it. Okay? One of the things, and it may be hard to see on here, some of the translations, like the New International Version, the NIV inclusive, the New Living Translation, today's New International Version, contain gender-neutral language. Some of them even changed the language of God to gender-neutral. They take away God's masculine gender identity. That's a complete essay on our society today and where it's at, right? So be mindful of that. The New Century Version does that. Some of them have no gender language for God, or no gender neutral language for God, but they use inclusive language for men. Now, that's not always bad. Some translations, old translations, will use mankind or man when the original Greek means humans, humankind. And so if that's what the Greek says, I don't have a problem with that. If that's what the manuscript evidence shows, I don't have a problem with that. It's kind of gender neutral because it's more inclusive, right? It means everyone. Stick to this end of the... Now, I'll tell you this. The American Standard 1901, if you can find one of them today, good luck. It's been out of print. Star Publishing stopped printing them years ago. I have a couple in my library. You just can't find them anymore. Okay? The Dixon Study Bible, can't find those anymore. What do I use? And I'll tell you, at some point in time, I use all these. Well, I shouldn't say all these. I use a spectrum in my study. When I'm teaching, when I'm preaching, I use the New American Standard. Now, I will use the New American Standard Updated or New American Standard Bible. You see those there on the end. The American Standard Version and the New American Standard Updated. Those are the two that I use for my study most of the time. Okay? Again, the American Standard, but the New American Standard, same manuscript family, just a new version of that. The King James, the New King James, the ESV, and the Holy Christian Standard Bible, I like it too. I will use those as my primary biblical sources, references. When I am studying, and this is New American Standard, when I'm studying and I read this passage and I'm struggling trying to understand what that passage means, the first thing I'll do is I'll go to every other verse that I can find about that subject or whatever is being said there to try to get clarity on that passage. If I think I've got clarity on that passage, but I'm not real sure, then I'll start going to some of these others. I'll go to the Thought for Thought. I may go to the NIV or something like that, or the New Revised Standard, or the New English Translation, and I'll look and see what it says. Sometimes, given the thought behind it, helps me understand it better. Okay? And then occasionally, when I want a good laugh, I'll go read the Message.